There are hands that were never meant to hold flowers. Eliza May Thornridge had hands like that. Wide across the knuckles, calloused at every crease, darkened by soil and weather and years of work that no one ever thanked her for. The morning her father was buried, those hands folded quietly in her lap while her brother read the will aloud. By sundown, those same hands carried everything she owned out the front door. She did not cry, not because she was strong, because she already knew. But what her brother did not know, what the cold town of Dry Hollow Creek did not know, was that somewhere beyond the frozen fields, something was waiting. Not rescue, not charity, something rarer than both. If this story speaks to you, stay until the end. You will understand why. The ground was still frozen the morning they put her father in it. Eliza stood at the graveside with her coat buttoned to the throat, the wind coming down off the ridgeline in long, bitter pulls that rattled the bare cottonwoods and sent dried leaves skittering across the headstones. Reverend Aldous spoke the words he always spoke. The small cluster of mourners nodded at the right moments. Her brother Gerald stood across the grave from her, his wife Nora pressed close to his side, both of them already wearing the careful, neutral expressions of people who had decided something and were simply waiting for the appropriate moment to say it. The moment came before supper. Gerald sat at the head of the table that had been their father's table, in the chair that had been their father's chair, and he set a single folded paper beside his plate. He did not look at Eliza when he spoke. He looked at the paper. He said their father had left the property, the livestock, and the remaining savings to him as the eldest son. He said there was a small sum set aside for Eliza, enough to cover 2 months of boarding at Mrs. Caulfield's house on the edge of town. He said this was more than generous given her circumstances, by which he meant her size, her plainness, the stubborn breadth of her shoulders, the fact that no man in 3 counties had ever come calling, and none ever would. Nora reached across and patted Gerald's hand as though he had just said something kind. Eliza looked at the paper. She looked at her brother's face. She thought of her father, of the way he used to watch her mend harness leather by lamplight, and say quietly that she had her mother's hands. Good hands, honest hands. She thought of all the mornings she had risen before either of them to start the stove and feed the animals, all the evenings she had sat up with sick calves while Gerald slept warm and undisturbed. She did not say any of that. She said, "I'll be gone by morning." And the boarding house took her in on the strength of that small inheritance and asked no questions, which suited Eliza fine. She paid her first month in full found work where she could and kept herself invisible. She mucked out stalls at the livery for 50 cents a day. She mended sailcloth and heavy canvas at the dry goods warehouse, her needle driving through material that would have split most women's fingertips. She sat with a rancher's sick draft horse for 2 nights, running brewing poultices from the dried herbs she carried in a tin her mother had given her years ago, and when the animal recovered, the rancher paid her $1 and looked at her with something close to disbelief. Word traveled. It usually did in a town like Dry Hollow Creek. But the word that traveled about Eliza was not the kind she would have chosen. The women at the millinery and the church social spoke of her in low voices. Too large, they said, too rough. No softness to her. It was almost a pity the way they said it, which made it worse than contempt. She paid her 2nd month at Mrs. Caulfield's and said nothing. November came in hard, the cold dropping fast, the sky pressing down white and featureless over the valley. Work dried up the way it always did when the ground froze, and men stopped needing extra hands. Eliza's tin of herbs stretched thin. Her meals stretched thinner. She took in what mending she could find and sat by the single candle Mrs. Caulfield allowed in the rooms after 7 o'clock, and worked until she could not see the stitches any more. On the 14th of November, she was $3 short of her rent. Mrs. Caulfield was not an unkind woman exactly. She was a practical one, which sometimes looked the same from the outside. She stood in the doorway of Eliza's small room with her arms crossed and her expression set, and explained that she ran a respectable house and could not be seen carrying charity cases, and that Eliza would need to be gone by morning. She said it the same way Gerald had said it, in that tone people use when they have already made peace with a thing and only need you to agree with them so everyone can move on. Eliza packed her tin and her coat and her single change of clothes. She stepped out into the night, and the cold hit her like a wall. She walked. She had no particular direction, only a way. The town thinned out behind her, the lamplight in the windows growing fewer and farther between until there was nothing ahead but the dark ridge line and the white fields and the snow that had begun to fall in slow, deliberate curtains. Her boots were not made for deep snow. She walked anyway. Her body, that sturdy, reliable body that had hauled grain and held down frightened animals and driven needles through canvas until her palms bled, carried her as far as it could. It carried her to the fence line of a property she did not know. Past the fence, set back from a long, unpaved track, a ranch house stood dark against the sky. A barn behind it, a scatter of outbuildings. No lights in the windows. No smoke from the chimney, which struck her as strange and cold like this. She did not make a decision exactly. Her body simply stopped. Her legs folded. She went down into the snow at the base of the fence post, the way a tree goes down slowly, and then all at once, and the cold wrapped around her like something patient, and the snow kept falling. She did not see the light appear in the ranch house window. She did not see the door open or the figure that came out across the frozen yard lantern, swinging low boots crunching through the crust of ice. She did not see any of it, but she felt dimly through the cold and the exhaustion and the long weight of everything the year had taken from her, a hand on her shoulder. Large, certain, unmistakably real. And then warmth. Not comfort, not kindness, just warmth, which was enough. Which was in that moment everything. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of someone moving in another room. Not the careful, quiet movements of a person trying not to disturb her. These were the movements of a person who had forgotten she was there, or had decided it did not matter. Boots on floorboards, the clank of an iron stove lid, water poured from a pitcher into a basin. Ordinary sounds, but each one landed strangely in her ears because she had not heard anything ordinary in a very long time. Eliza lay still for a moment and took stock of herself. She was on a cot near a fireplace that had burned down to coals. Someone had removed her boots and covered her with a wool blanket that smelled of cedar and horses. Her coat was hanging on a peg by the door. Her tin of herbs sat on the floor beside her undisturbed. She drew it up. The man standing at the kitchen stove had his back to her. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair shot through with early gray, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to move through his own house like a visitor. He did not turn around when she shifted on the cot. He said without preamble, "Coffee." It was not an offer exactly. It was more like a statement of available fact. She said, "Thank you." He set a tin cup on the table without looking at her and went back to whatever he was doing at the stove. She crossed the room, wrapped her hands around the cup, and stood there drinking it slowly while she looked at the kitchen. Clean but sparse. A single plate drying on a cloth beside the basin. No signs of a woman's presence anywhere. No curtains, no dried flowers, no second chair pulled close to the fire. The chair at the table was the only one positioned for use. The other sat in the corner with a coat draped over it that had not been moved in some time. His name, she would learn, was Caleb Boone Ashford, and he told her this the way he told her everything briefly and without decoration. He had found her at his fence line just after midnight. He had carried her inside because leaving her there would have been the same as leaving her to die, and he was not prepared to carry that. He said this last part with a flatness that made it sound like accounting rather than charity, which she found strangely easier to accept than kindness would have been. He offered her the barn. Not the barn as an insult, the barn as a practical arrangement. It was warmer than most people's rooms in winter, he explained, with the animals generating heat and the walls packed tight against the wind. He had a spare cot. He could move out there. He needed someone to handle the morning feeding and the fence checks on the north pasture. He would pay 50 cents a day and a hot meal at noon. Eliza set down her cup. She said, "When do I start?" He looked at her then for the first time directly, and she met it without flinching. Whatever he was looking for, she did not know if he found it. But after a moment he said, "Soon as you've finished that coffee," and turned back to the stove. She started that morning. The Ashford Ranch was not in ruin, but it was close enough that the difference was mostly a matter of time. The north fence had sections that leaned rather than stood. The hayloft needed rebanking along the east wall where weather had worked its way in. 3 of his cattle were showing signs of a winter cough that could spread quickly if left unaddressed. Eliza moved through all of it with the methodical efficiency of someone who has never had the luxury of doing one thing at a time. She noted the sick cattle on the 3rd day and brought it to Caleb directly. He stood in the barn doorway watching her crouch beside the youngest of the 3, her hand pressed flat against its flank, and his expression was the same closed, unreadable thing it always was. She told him what she thought it was, what her mother had used for it, and that she had enough dried herbs in her tin to treat the animals if he would allow it. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped. Then he said, "Do it." She did. The cattle recovered. By the end of her 2nd week, the north fence stood straight, the hayloft held against the wind, and the animals were eating with the steady appetite of creatures that felt safe. Caleb paid her on time and in full each Saturday, setting the coins on the edge of the workbench without ceremony. She took them the same way. It was a quiet arrangement, functional, and she was grateful for it in the deep, careful way of someone who has learned not to be grateful for too much at once in case it is taken away. The arrangement did not stay quiet. Gerald found her on a Tuesday in late December, arriving at the ranch gate on horseback, with the particular air of a man who considers his own arrival a form of authority. He had heard through the reliable machinery of small-town gossip that his sister was earning a wage. Under the legal statutes of the territory, a woman's earnings belonged to her nearest male kin unless she was married. He had ridden out to collect what he considered his due. Caleb was in the yard when Gerald dismounted. Eliza came out of the barn behind him. The 3 of them stood in the cold, with their breath clouding the air between them. Gerald did not acknowledge Caleb. He looked at Eliza and said, "You'll hand over what you've saved and come home where you belong." Eliza said nothing. She had been waiting for this in some part of herself since the moment she left. The waiting had not made it easier, but it had made her steadier. Caleb stepped forward, not aggressively, just forward so that he was standing beside her rather than behind her, which changed the geometry of the whole conversation. He said quietly, "She's my wife." Gerald blinked. Nora, had she been there, would have understood immediately what was happening. Gerald was slower. He looked at Eliza, then at Caleb, then back at Eliza, his expression cycling through confusion, and then something uglier that he did not quite get to say out loud. Caleb did not elaborate. He did not need to. The law was the law, and he had just used it the same way Gerald had intended to. Gerald left. That evening after supper, Eliza and Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and arranged the facts of it plainly. He had told the lie to protect her wages. The lie would require a legal document to hold, or Gerald could come back with a magistrate. The marriage would be in name only. His house, her labor. Clear boundaries, no expectations on either side beyond the work. She listened to all of it and then asked him one question. She asked him why. He looked at the lamp for a moment before he answered. Then he said, "Because your brother rode up here like you were a piece of property he'd misplaced, and I found that I had an objection to it." He said it simply, almost clinically, as though the feeling underneath it were a minor inconvenience he was reporting on someone else's behalf. Eliza looked at his face, at the deep lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, and understood that this was the most honest thing he knew how to offer. She accepted it. They signed the papers 3 days later at the county office and rode back to the ranch in silence, sitting just far enough apart on the wagon bench that no part of them touched. The sky was pale and enormous over the valley. The horses knew the way home. She told herself that was enough. And for the time being, it was. Spring came to the Ashford Ranch the way it always does in high country, reluctantly and all at once. One morning the ground was still iron-hard beneath Eliza's boots, and the next the mud was pulling at her heels as she crossed the yard, and the cattle were restless with the change in the air, and the light lasted a full hour longer than it had the week before. She noticed all of it. She had always noticed things. It was one of the few habits she had never been made to feel ashamed of. The ranch had changed since December. Not dramatically, not in any single visible way, but in the cumulative fashion of a place that is being consistently attended to. The north fence held. The hayloft was dry. The cattle that had been coughing in November were fat and easy moving in their pasture. She had planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, the seeds purchased from the dry goods store on her own wages, and the first shoots were already breaking through the dark soil in thin, determined lines. Caleb had not commented on the garden. He had looked at it one morning on his way to the barn, stopped, and then continued walking. That was the closest thing to approval she had learned to read in him. They had settled into a rhythm that was on the surface purely practical. She cooked, and he ate. He made decisions about the livestock, and she carried them out, often improving on them in small ways that he either did not notice or chose not to mention. In the evenings they sat in the kitchen, him with whatever accounts needed, reviewing her with her mending or her herb preparations, the lamp burning between them while the fire worked down to coals. They did not talk much, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing a space. It was something with more texture to it, something that required more care. She was not foolish enough to name it. The first Saturday of April, she hitched the wagon to drive into Dry Hollow Creek for supplies. Caleb was repairing the secondary water trough and did not offer to come, which was usual. She went alone, which was also usual, and tied the wagon outside Mercer's general store and went in with her list. She was loading flour into a sack when she heard them. There were 3 of them women she recognized by sight, if not by name, the kind of women who anchor themselves to the social geography of a small town and consider observation a form of civic duty. They were standing near the bolts of fabric at the back of the store, and they were not troubling themselves to speak quietly. One of them said it was a strange arrangement a man like Caleb Ashford taking up with a woman like that. Another said she had heard the marriage was not a real one, that it was a business matter, which was hardly surprising given the woman involved. The third, the youngest of them, glanced toward Eliza and then away with the particular studied casualness of someone who wants to be seen not looking. Eliza set down the flour sack. She looked at her hands on the counter. The knuckles were enlarged from cold weather and years of heavy work. The palms were layered with callus in the places where tools and ropes and leather had worn the skin down and rebuilt it tougher than before. There was a scar along the base of her left thumb from a fence wire that had snapped back one January morning 3 years ago. She had wrapped it herself and kept working. She picked up the flour sack again. She walked to the back of the store, not toward the door, and stopped in the aisle near the fabric bolts close enough that politeness required acknowledgement. The 3 women went still in the particular way of people who have been caught. Eliza looked at the one who had spoken first and said calmly, "I expect you've been getting a lot of use out of my business this winter. Most people in this town have." She let a beat pass. "These hands put 3 of Aldous Perkins' horses through a lung sickness in November. They re-shingled the feed store roof when the Mercer boy was ill. They've delivered 2 calves and set a broken fence line that kept the Hartley cattle from wandering onto the creek road." She looked down at her palms and then back up. "I've never once been ashamed of what they are. I'm not about to start." She went back to her list. She was carrying the last of the supplies to the wagon when Caleb appeared at the end of the street. He had ridden, in which meant he had decided to come after all, and he tied his horse to the post beside the wagon and took the heavy sack from her arms without being asked. He loaded it into the wagon bed and then straightened and looked at her face with the quiet, precise attention he sometimes turned on her when he thought something had happened. He said, "What?" She said, "Nothing that needed your help." He held her gaze for a moment and then said, "I know." He reached out and took her right hand and held it up between them, examining it as though reading something written there. He turned it over once, looking at the callus and the old scar. Then he looked across the street to where the 3 women were now standing on the millinery steps watching. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said clearly enough to carry, "I married the most capable person in this county. I'm aware of that every day." He looked at Eliza then, not at the women, and something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. He released her hand and climbed up to the wagon bench. She stood on the street for one more moment. She felt the warmth in her palm where he had held it. She felt the weight of every cold month behind her, and something lighter moving in ahead, something she did not yet have a name for. She climbed up beside him. They rode out of Dry Hollow Creek without looking back, the wagon moving steadily along the rutted road, the spring sky enormous and pale above the valley. Halfway home, without preamble, Caleb said, "The south pasture fence needs another day's work." She said, "I know, I was going to do it Wednesday." He nodded, said nothing more. But his shoulder, riding beside hers on the narrow bench, did not pull away from the contact as it had in December. She noticed. She said nothing, but she did not pull away either, and the horses moved on through the afternoon light, knowing the way home, the way they always did, steady and unhurried, as though there were no reason in the world to rush. That night she lay awake longer than usual, not from worry, from something she had nearly forgotten the shape of. The garden would need watering in the morning. The south pasture fence would need 2 days, not 1 if the corner post was, as she suspected. She planned the work, but underneath it, quieter and more persistent, was the memory of his hand around hers on a public street, and the way he had looked at her face, not the women, not the crowd, just her. She let herself hold that thought for exactly as long as it took to fall asleep, and then she released it carefully into the dark. The summer came in wrong. Eliza knew it by June. The grass in the south pasture went yellow 2 weeks ahead of its time, and the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the Ashford land dropped to a trickle that left a pale mineral line on the stones, the kind of watermark that meant the source was failing, not just the flow. The cattle clustered near the shade of the canyon wall in the afternoons and did not move with their usual ease. The air smelled of dry rock and something faintly electric, the way it smells before weather that has not decided what it wants to be. Caleb watched the sky the way a man watches something he has learned not to trust. He said very little about it, which was not unusual, but the quality of his silence changed. At supper he would stop eating for a moment and listen as though he could hear something through the walls. At night, Eliza sometimes heard him moving through the house in the hours before dawn, his boots on the floorboards, the sound of the back door opening and closing quietly as he went to stand in the yard and look toward the canyon. She did not ask. She had learned that some things in him required approach from the side, not head-on. By mid-July, the drought was a declared fact. Dry Hollow Creek had not had a summer like it in 20 years, and the older ranchers spoke about it in town with the flat acceptance of people who have been through bad things before, and understand that understanding does not make them smaller. Water allocations became the central politics of every conversation. 2 ranchers on the North Road came to blows over a shared irrigation ditch, and the sheriff rode out to settle it and came back looking tired. The Ashford Ranch held because Eliza had moved the herd to the lower pasture in May, following her instinct about the creek levels, and had begun rationing the well water before most people in the valley had acknowledged there was a problem. Caleb had not questioned the decision. He had watched her redirect the cattle with the same expression he always used when she did something he had not thought of himself. Quiet. Attentive. Not quite surprised anymore, but still registering it. It was the first week of August when she found the photograph. She was not looking for it. She was washing down the shelf above the fireplace, a task that had been waiting since spring, and she moved a small wooden box to wipe beneath it, and the box slid and fell, and the lid came loose, and the photograph slid out onto the hearth. She picked it up. A woman young with a direct and confident gaze, holding an infant against her shoulder with the natural ease of someone entirely at home in that posture. They were standing in front of this same house identifiable by the particular angle of the porch railing and the large flat stone at the base of the front step. The woman was laughing at whoever held the camera, and the infant had one small fist raised, and the light on both of them was the particular gold of a late afternoon in early fall. Eliza stood with the photograph in her hands for a moment. She put it back into the box carefully in the same position she had found it. She replaced the box on the shelf and continued washing. That evening at supper, Caleb was quieter than usual, which was a degree of quiet she had not encountered in him before. He ate without tasting anything, she could tell by the mechanical way he worked through the meal, and twice he stopped and looked at the fireplace shelf with an expression she had no category for. Then she understood. He had seen the box moved. He knew she had found it. She said she looked like someone who knew exactly where she was. He went very still. She said it gently, not as an opening for sentiment, but as a plain observation the way she said most things. The woman in the photograph. She looked settled, like she belonged exactly where she was standing. Caleb set down his fork. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "Her name was Catherine. The boy was Thomas. He was 14 months old." He said it the way people name the dead, with precision, because precision is what's left. She waited. He said, "The barn fire was in October 3 years ago. Faulty lantern. I was in the south pasture when it started." He stopped. His jaw worked once. By the time I reached the yard, the roof was already gone. The room was very quiet. The fire in the stove ticked. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say anything for a moment because she understood that what he had just given her was not a bid for comfort. It was an explanation. It was the piece of information that made all the other pieces make sense. The locked-off rooms, the chair in the corner, the way he stood in the yard at night, looking toward the canyon, as though listening for something that was no longer there. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once. He picked up his fork. He did not eat, but he held it, which was its own kind of effort. 3 nights later she woke to the smell. Not wood smoke, something larger and wilder and deeply wrong. She was at the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw to the south lit the canyon walls in a color that had no business being there. Orange and deep red, moving and restless, sending columns of gray smoke boiling up into a sky that had gone the color of old copper. She pulled on her boots, running. The wind was coming from the south, which was the worst possible direction, pushing the fire in a direct line up the canyon toward the ranch. She could hear it now, a low, continuous roar beneath the wind, like something vast clearing its throat. The cattle in the lower pasture were already moving. She could hear them. 2. The panicked percussion of hooves on dry ground. Caleb was already in the yard. He was standing completely still, facing the fire, and something about the stillness was immediately wrong. Not the stillness of a man assessing a situation. The stillness of a man who has gone somewhere else entirely. She crossed the yard to him and said his name. He did not respond. She came around to face him directly, and what she saw stopped her cold. His eyes were open and focused, but not on the fire in front of him, on something else, something only he could see. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his hands hanging at his sides were shaking with a fine, continuous tremor. She said his name again, sharply. He said in a voice she had not heard from him before, quiet and terrible, "I can hear them." The canyon roared. The smoke rolled over the yard in a hot wave. She reached out and gripped his arm, and his muscles were rigid as fence wire beneath her hands, his whole body locked into a past that was consuming him as surely as the fire was consuming the canyon. He took one step toward the flames. She moved without thinking. Both hands on his chest, her full weight thrown against him, driving him back 2 steps, and then she grabbed his face in her calloused hands and pulled it down to hers and said his name with everything she had. His eyes did not clear. Not yet. He was still somewhere in October 3 years ago in a yard lit by a different fire, and the sound he made was something she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. The fire crested the canyon rim. She did not let go of his face. The fire came over the canyon rim in a wall of orange and black, and the wind ahead of it hit them like a physical blow, hot and grit-filled, and the cattle in the lower pasture screamed the way animals scream when they understand what is coming. Eliza held Caleb's face in both hands and put herself directly in his line of sight and said his name again and again, and then she stopped saying his name and said something else. She said, "Look at me. I am Eliza. I am standing right here in front of you. They are gone, Caleb. They have been gone 3 years, and I cannot change that. But I am here right now, and I am not gone. And if you walk into that fire, you will not be joining them. You will only be leaving me." The wind roared. Ash came down around them like gray snow. His eyes moved. Slowly, like a man surfacing from deep water, his focus shifted from whatever he had been seeing to her face directly in front of his. She watched it happen, watched the present moment reassemble itself behind his eyes, and then he was back, fully back, breathing hard, his hands coming up to grip her wrists where she held him. He said her name, just that, once. She said, "The barn. We have to move." He did not need to be told twice. Whatever had broken open in him closed around the necessity of the moment, and he moved and she moved with him, and for the next 2 hours there was no past and no future, only the fire and the work. They released the cattle first, driving them through the north gate and away from the smoke. Caleb on horseback cutting off the strays, while Eliza moved on foot, her voice steady and carrying, directing the animals with the calm authority that they responded to without question. Then the horses from the barn. Then the feed stores they could drag clear of the building. They wet down the north and west walls of the house, with every bucket they could work between them, hand over hand. From the well, their arms burning their lungs full of smoke. The barn they could not save. She knew it before Caleb did, or before he was willing to say it. The wind shifted 2 degrees, and the fire found the east wall, and it went fast, the old dry timber taking the flame with an eagerness that was almost violent. She grabbed his arm when he moved toward it and said, "No, not for a structure." He looked at her. She held his gaze. He stopped. They watched it go. She did not look at his face while the barn burned. She looked at the fire and kept her hand on his arm, and she felt him trembling, not from fear this time, but from the effort of staying present while something in him wanted very badly to leave again. She pressed her hand harder against his arm. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that until the roof came down. Then she said, "The trench. East side of the house." He picked up the shovel. They worked through the small hours of the morning, digging a fire break along the eastern perimeter, piling the turned earth into a low berm that would give the house a fighting chance if the wind shifted again. The work was brutal, the hardest Eliza had done in a season of hard work, and she did not think about anything except the blade of the shovel and the next foot of ground, and the sound of Caleb working beside her in the dark and the smoke. At some point the wind changed, not dramatically, but enough turning southward and taking the main body of the fire back toward the canyon it had come from. By 3 in the morning they could see stars in the north. By 4, the roaring had dropped to a low, distant crackle. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, the fire was aglow on the canyon walls, contained and retreating, and the house was standing. The barn was ash and black timber. The south pasture fence was gone. 3 outbuildings had taken damage, and 2 had not survived. But the house was standing, and the cattle were in the north pasture, and the horses were tied to the fence post beside the road, and Eliza Ashford was sitting on the front step with her forearms on her knees and her head down, too tired to move and not needing to. She heard Caleb sit down beside her. For a long time neither of them spoke. The morning came in slowly, the way it does after a night like that, as though the light itself is being careful. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth, and somewhere, improbably, the green smell of the kitchen garden on the south wall, which had somehow survived. He said, "You did not run." She said, "No." "I told you to. When I came back to myself, I told you to take the horse and go." "I heard you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have spent 3 years being very careful not to need anyone." She looked at the smoke rising in the south. "I know." "It did not work." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at his hands open in his lap. The knuckles split and blackened a burn along the back of his right forearm where he had taken something falling from the barn before she had pulled him clear. He looked exhausted in the particular way of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has only just put it down. He said, "I love you, not as a replacement for what I lost, not because you saved the ranch or the cattle or any of it." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them, the complicated grief in them still present, but no longer in command. "I love you because you held my face in your hands in front of a fire and told me you were here, and because that was enough to bring me back." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her brother's dining room table and the folded paper and the way Nora had patted Gerald's hand. She thought about the boarding house and the snow at the fence line. She thought about the 3 women at the millinery, and her own hands held up in the lamplight of Mercer's General Store, and the way she had looked at her own palms and found nothing there to be ashamed of. She said, "I have been told my whole life that I was too much, too large, too rough, too plain, too stubborn, that I was a burden that no one would choose." She looked at the ash and the standing house and the green line of the garden along the south wall. "I spent a long time believing it." She reached out and took his burned hand carefully and held it. She said, "I do not believe it any more." He closed his fingers around hers. They sat like that on the front step of the house they had saved in the smoke and the early light while the valley came back to itself around them. The cattle moved in the north pasture. A hawk turned slow circles above the canyon rim. The kitchen garden stood in its green, improbable rows, and somewhere behind the hills the sun was coming up with the patient, indifferent certainty of a thing that does not need anyone's permission to shine. The barn would need to be rebuilt. The fence would take most of the fall. The south pasture would recover by next spring if the water held, and she already had thoughts about the water. But that was later. That was the work of the days ahead, which they had earned by surviving this one. For now she sat in the morning light with her hand in his and let it be enough. It was, as it turned out, more than enough. It was everything.